An unknown intern had just discovered a cleverly hidden secret in the contract, a warning of a $100 million trap. She knew that silence was safe, but speaking out could change her life. She had no choice but to take a gamble. Was her action right or wrong? Before we find out, where are you listening to this story from? Share with me. In the sleek boardroom of Halden Corporation, high above the bustling streets of New York, the air hummed with the quiet power of big money. Danny's voice was soft but commanding, mixed with the confidence of a man who always wins. "This deal secures our dominance for the next decade," he said, gesturing to the projected slides. Daniel felt the familiar thrill of control. No surprises, that was his world. At 31, he was the self-made force behind Halden Corp., a financial empire he'd built from sheer will and razor-sharp instincts. His tall frame filled out a tailored suit perfectly, but it was his eyes, dark, piercing like polished obsidian, that cut through any pretense. They scanned the room now, locking onto each board member as he outlined the $4 billion merger. Seated at the far end, almost invisible among the suits, was Charlie Buckner. 23, fresh out of law school, she was just an intern, scribbling notes on a yellow pad. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her clothes neat but unremarkable, nothing to draw attention in this den of power players. But Charlie's mind was anything but ordinary. As Daniel spoke, she pored over the contract drafts, her sharp eyes catching a subtle clause buried in the fine print. It was clever, almost invisible. A liability trap that could expose Halden to lawsuits worth hundreds of millions down the line. Her heart quickened. She knew the safe play was to stay quiet, blend in like the wallpaper. But something deeper stirred. A sense of rightness she couldn't ignore. Growing up in a cramped apartment with a father whose medical bills stacked higher than her dreams, Charlie had learned early that silence could cost more than speaking up. This wasn't just a job, it was survival. The room hung on Daniel's words, nods rippling around the table like a well-rehearsed symphony. He paused for effect, savoring the moment before sealing the pitch. That's when Charlie's hand rose, tentative at first, then steady. The motion sliced through the air like an unexpected ripple in still water. Heads turned, murmurs flickering. Daniel's gaze snapped to her, those sharp eyes narrowing. Who was this? An intern? Daring to interrupt? Irritation flared in his chest. He'd built this company on unchallenged authority. But as she spoke, her voice clear and measured, laying out the flaw in precise, unemotional terms, the room froze. Section 19.5, she said, pointing to the document. It's a backdoor for class action suits. If we proceed, we're walking into a minefield. Daniel's mind raced. He scanned the page she'd referenced, and damn it, she was right. The clause was a poison pill, hidden so artfully he'd missed it in the rush. How had his team overlooked this? Fury bubbled up, not at the deal, but at being exposed like this, in front of everyone. His jaw tightened, the mask of control cracking just a fraction. The board shifted uncomfortably, whispers building. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a spark of something unfamiliar. Not just anger, but intrigue. This nobody had pierced his armor with nothing but brains and guts. He straightened, forcing his voice steady. "Meeting adjourned," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. "We'll reconvene after a full review." As the room emptied, board members filing out with sidelong glances, Daniel lingered, watching Charlie gather her notes. She didn't flinch under his stare, just met it with quiet resolve. Inside, she felt a mix of triumph and dread. This could be her ticket up or her fast track out the door. But she'd done what was right, and that small victory warmed her against the chill of uncertainty. Daniel, meanwhile, wrestled with the disruption. Who was this woman, shaking his unshakable world? He turned away, the question lingering like an uninvited guest. The merger hung in limbo, but something else had just begun, a challenge he hadn't seen coming. The elevator doors closed on the last executive, leaving the boardroom echoing with silence. Daniel paced to the window, the city lights blurring as his thoughts sharpened. Control was his lifeline, the wall he'd erected after years of clawing to the top. Yet this intern had breached it effortlessly. Not with charm or connections, but pure intellect. It irked him, but beneath that, a reluctant respect took root. He needed to know more about her. Charlie, stepping into the hall, exhaled slowly. Her father's latest hospital bill weighed heavy in her mind, a reminder that risks like this weren't optional. She'd survived worse. She'd handle whatever came next. Little did she know, the real test was just starting. The elevator ride up to the penthouse office felt like an eternity to Charlie, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm the knot in her stomach. She'd been summoned by a curt email from Daniel's assistant. No details, just a time and place. As the doors slid open, she stepped into a space that screamed quiet dominance. Vast, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below, like a king surveying his realm. The room was minimalist, all sleek lines and polished surfaces, dark leather chairs, a massive desk with nothing out of place, and the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with fresh coffee. But beneath the polish, there was an undercurrent of isolation, as if the height kept everything and everyone at a distance. Daniel stood by the window, his back to her at first, hands clasped behind him. He turned slowly, those piercing eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of someone used to unraveling secrets. He'd spent the last hour reviewing her file, top of her class at a state law school. No fancy connections, just raw talent that had somehow landed her this internship. It didn't add up. Why risk everything in that meeting? He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, his movement precise, controlled. "Sit," he said, his voice low but edged with authority. Inside, curiosity gnawed at him. People usually folded under his gaze. She hadn't even blinked in the boardroom. Charlie took the seat, her posture straight, refusing to let the opulence intimidate her. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, like a spotlight probing for weaknesses. This job was her lifeline, but she wouldn't compromise her principles for it. As Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the desk, he fired the first question. Sharp, direct, questioning her motives. Was she trying to sabotage the deal? Or just grandstanding for attention? A sharp, direct question, questioning her motives. She met his challenge head-on, her responses calm and layered with legal precision. No emotion, just facts, citing precedents, dissecting the clause's implications with the clarity of someone who'd pored over law books until her eyes burned. Daniel pressed harder, his questions twisting like a prosecutor's, probing for cracks in her story. Why speak up now? What did she stand to gain? Each query was designed to unsettle, to assert his control. But Charlie didn't waver. She countered with logic that cut through his assumptions, explaining how the trap could unravel years of work, not just for the company, but for the people it employed. Deep down, a flicker of defiance burned in her. This wasn't about impressing him. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant walking away broke. As the exchange intensified, Daniel felt a shift he hadn't anticipated. Her intellect wasn't flashy, it was solid, unyielding, like a foundation built to last. He'd dealt with sharp minds before, but hers came without the ego, wrapped in quiet integrity that made his own world feel a bit hollow. The city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to the tension building in the room. He leaned back, masking his growing intrigue with a neutral expression. Who was she, really? Not just an intern, but someone who saw through the gloss to the risks beneath. It unsettled him, this breach in his carefully curated control, stirring a reluctant admiration he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Charlie sensed the subtle change in his demeanor, the way his questions slowed, becoming less accusatory and more exploratory. But she kept her guard up, aware that vulnerability here could cost her everything. Thoughts of her father flashed through her mind, his frail form in the hospital bed, the way he'd always encouraged her to fight for justice, no matter the odds. This confrontation wasn't just professional, it was personal, a test of whether she could hold her own in a world that chewed up people like her. By the time Daniel finally nodded, dismissing her with a brief, "We'll discuss this further," the air in the room had thickened with unspoken possibilities. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and headed for the elevator, her mind racing. Had she won a reprieve, or just delayed the fallout? Daniel watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. For the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of genuine curiosity, not about the deal, but about the woman who'd just turned his predictable afternoon upside down. The city stretched out below, vast and impersonal, mirroring the solitude he rarely admitted. What would come next? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. Charlie Buckner wasn't going anywhere just yet. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Daniel's penthouse office, turning the glass walls into mirrors that reflected the city's relentless pulse. Charlie stood by the elevator doors after their tense exchange, her hand hovering over the call button. But Daniel's voice stopped her cold. He hadn't dismissed her outright. Instead, he circled back to his desk, his mind churning like a machine recalibrating after a glitch. He'd probed every angle of her story, tested her resolve, and come up empty-handed on any hidden agenda. She wasn't bluffing or scheming, she was just right. It grated on him, this inability to bend her to his will. In his world, people either crumbled or curried favor. She did neither. A spark of something unfamiliar flickered in his chest. Not defeat, but a strange pull, like discovering a puzzle piece that didn't fit his carefully assembled picture. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, studying her as if she were a complex financial model. The merger was too critical to ignore her insight, and firing her now would only raise questions among the board. No, better to harness that sharp mind. Keep her close, where he could watch. "I have a proposal," he said finally, his tone measured, like a businessman closing a deal. He'd frame it as an opportunity. But really, it was a leash. Assign her to review the entire contract personally, report directly to him, no intermediaries. It would mean long hours, total immersion in his operations, but it would also spotlight her talent, perhaps even lead to a permanent role. Inside, Daniel wondered at his own motives. Was this about the company? Or was he curious about cracking that unyielding integrity? Who was she, really, to challenge him without flinching? The thought lingered, a quiet itch he couldn't scratch. Charlie turned back, her expression neutral, but her thoughts raced ahead. To the cramped hospital room where her father lay, hooked up to machines that beeped like accusing reminders of unpaid bills. The latest round of chemo had hit hard, leaving him weaker, and her part-time shifts at the coffee shop barely covered the copays. This internship was supposed to be her break, a foot in the door to stability. But speaking up in that meeting had jeopardized everything. Now Daniel's offer hung in the air like a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. Reviewing the contract meant diving deeper into Halden's inner workings, exposing herself to more scrutiny, more pressure. But refusing? That could mean the end. Unemployed, back to square one, watching her father's health slip further away. She weighed it in seconds, her practical side winning out. Survival wasn't a choice. It was necessity. "I'll do it," she replied simply, her voice steady, masking the swirl of relief and apprehension. As they hashed out the details, timelines, access to files, confidential briefings, the room felt smaller, charged with an unspoken shift. Daniel outlined expectations with his usual precision. Daily updates, no leaks, absolute discretion. He watched her nod, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she absorbed it all without complaint. It intrigued him more than he cared to admit, this quiet strength, so different from the polished ambition he encountered daily. For a moment he imagined her backstory, piecing together fragments from her file. No silver spoon, just grit. It stirred a reluctant respect, chipping at the walls he'd built around his solitary empire. Charlie, meanwhile, focused on the practicalities, mentally mapping out how to juggle this with hospital visits and her meager budget. The work would be grueling, but it paid. Enough to keep the lights on, maybe even catch up on those bills. Yet, as she agreed to the terms, a quiet dread settled in. She was stepping fully into his orbit now, no easy escape. By the time she left, contract revisions already downloading to her laptop, the sun had set, the office bathed in the artificial glow of city lights. Daniel stood alone again, staring out at the twinkling expanse, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. This wasn't just about fixing a deal. It was a gamble on an unknown variable. Her. Charlie rode the elevator down, the descent mirroring her mixed emotions, grounded in necessity but wary of the heights ahead. The corporate tower loomed behind her as she stepped into the evening bustle, her world now tethered to his. How long could she navigate this power play without losing herself? The question hung unspoken, a hook pulling her forward into the unknown. The days blurred into a rhythm of late nights and early mornings in the Halden Corp conference room, a space that had become their unofficial battleground. Stacks of documents towered on the long table, lit by the harsh glow of overhead lights and the soft hum of laptops. Daniel sat at one end, sleeves rolled up, his usual polished exterior fraying just a bit from the grind. He'd thrown himself into the contract review with his trademark intensity, expecting to steer the process like every other deal, efficient, unchallenged. But Charlie, positioned across from him with her notes spread out like a map of potential pitfalls, turned every session into a quiet showdown. She wasn't aggressive, just precise, picking apart clauses with a logic that exposed not just legal flaws, but the ethical shortcuts baked into the company's playbook. It started small, like when they hit a section on employee protections. Daniel argued for the standard language, vague enough to give the firm flexibility in layoffs if the merger soured. "It's business," he said curtly, leaning back as if that settled it. But Charlie pushed back, her voice even, pointing out how it skirted labor laws and left workers vulnerable. She drew from real cases she'd studied, painting pictures of families upended by corporate decisions, her words landing like subtle jabs that made him pause. Inside, Daniel felt that familiar tug of irritation morphing into something else. He was used to dictating terms, but her points forced him to defend his worldview, one built on winning at all costs. Who was she to question the empire he'd forged? Yet, as she laid out alternatives, fairer terms that still protected profits, he found himself listening. Really listening. A crack forming in his ironclad control. The confrontations escalated over environmental riders in the deal. Daniel saw them as minor concessions, necessary grease for the wheels of big finance. Regulations change. We adapt, he countered during one heated exchange, his fingers drumming the table in frustration. Charlie didn't raise her voice, but she dissected the implications with surgical calm.
potential fines, reputational hits, even long-term damage to communities. She shared a quick story from her research, a small town poisoned by a similar oversight, making it personal without overdoing it. Daniel's mind raced. Her integrity wasn't performative, it was bone deep, clashing with his pragmatic cynicism. He tried to redirect, probing her suggestions for weaknesses, but each time she held firm, backing her ideas with data that stood up to scrutiny. A reluctant admiration stirred in him, mixed with helplessness. He couldn't bulldoze her, and part of him didn't want to.
This wasn't the deference he got from his team. It was a partnership he hadn't asked for, yet it sparked a curiosity that kept him engaged long after the clock ticked past midnight. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, they clashed over a non-compete clause buried deep in the annex. Daniel defended it fiercely. It locked in talent, secured the merger's value. But Charlie saw it as a cage, trapping employees in unfair binds. She illustrated with hypotheticals, her eyes steady, challenging him to see the human cost. For a moment, the room felt charged, not just with disagreement, but with an undercurrent of mutual respect. Daniel leaned forward, countering with market realities, but her responses made him question his own shortcuts for the first time. Frustration built in his chest, not at her, but at how she unraveled his assumptions. He caught himself watching her, noting the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, focused and unyielding. This woman, from nowhere in his world, was forcing him to evolve, and it both unnerved and intrigued him. The helplessness of not controlling the narrative twisted into a quiet thrill. What else could she teach him? By the end of the week, the contract was reshaping under their combined efforts, stronger but fairer. Daniel stood by the window during a break, coffee in hand, staring at the city lights below. Working with her had exposed fissures in his approach, turning his solo command into a dialogue. Curiosity bloomed into admiration. She wasn't just smart, she was principled in a way that made his achievements feel a tad emptier. Charlie, packing up her notes, felt the weight of it all, balancing this intensity with rushed hospital visits, where her father's weak smile reminded her why she fought these battles. The clashes exhausted her, but they also ignited a spark. In this high-stakes arena, she was holding her own, proving her worth. As they wrapped up, the room held a tentative harmony, a budding alliance forged in fire. But beneath it, tension simmered, hinting at deeper shifts on the horizon. The office corridors of Halden Corp buzzed with the usual midday hum, phones ringing softly, keyboards clacking like distant rain. But for Charlie, it felt like walking into a storm. She'd been buried in the merger revisions for weeks now, her days stretching into evenings under the fluorescent lights, balancing the high-wire act of Daniel's expectations with her own quiet resolve. The work was intense but rewarding in its way. She'd caught glimpses of progress, moments where their debates sharpened the deal into something solid. Yet today, as she headed to the legal department for a routine file pull, a new shadow loomed in the form of Laura Wilkinson, her direct supervisor. Laura was a fixture in the firm, with a polished resume and an even sharper wardrobe, tailored blazers that screamed authority, heels that clicked like judgments. What's more, she is also Daniel's childhood friend, and he only had her by his side until Laura appeared. The fear that everything she has worked so hard for seems to be about to be lost, including Daniel, the person she secretly loves. She'd climbed the ranks through calculated alliances, always one step ahead in the corporate game. But lately, from her corner office with its partial view of the executive floor, she'd watched Charlie's sudden rise with narrowing eyes. It started innocently enough, spotting Charlie lingering after meetings with Daniel, their heads bent over documents,
his usual curt nods turning into something almost engaged. Whispers rippled through the halls. The intern who'd saved the merger, now working side by side with the CEO? To Laura, it stung like a personal slight. She'd put in years, navigated the politics, only to see this newcomer, fresh-faced and unconnected, leapfrog ahead. Jealousy coiled in her gut, disguised as professional concern.
Who does this girl think she is to upset the hierarchy and position next to Daniel that was originally meant for her? It happened during a team huddle that afternoon. The legal staff gathered around a conference table littered with coffee cups and highlighted briefs. Laura stood at the front, her smile tight as she doled out assignments. When she got to Charlie, her voice carried a honeyed edge, praising her impressive initiative in front of the group before piling on the load. "You'll handle the full compliance audit on the subsidiary assets," she said, sliding a thick binder across the table. "And cross-reference it with the international regs. Oh, and flag any antitrust overlaps by morning." The tasks were monumental, a mountain of paperwork that would take a team days. But Laura framed it as a growth opportunity, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The room shifted uncomfortably. Colleagues exchanged glances, sensing the overload, but no one spoke up. Charlie felt the weight settle on her shoulders like an extra layer of exhaustion. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral, but inside, panic flickered. How to fit this in without crumbling? Back at her desk, buried under the avalanche of files, Charlie dove in as the office emptied out. The clock ticked past 6, then 8, the city outside darkening into a sea of twinkling lights. Her eyes burned from scanning dense legalese, her fingers flying across the keyboard to compile reports that Laura knew were impossible on such short notice. Thoughts of her father intruded like uninvited guests. His latest doctor's appointment tomorrow, the one she'd promised to attend, now threatened by this all-nighter. The hospital bills loomed in her mind, a constant undercurrent, reminding her why she endured. Skipping sleep meant foggy decisions, but quitting wasn't an option. Not when every paycheck chipped away at the debt. Laura's move wasn't subtle. It was a clear message, a thorn pressed into her side to remind her of her place. Charlie paused once, rubbing her temples, wondering if Daniel noticed these undercurrents, but she pushed the thought away. Survival meant focusing, not complaining. As midnight approached, the building grew eerily quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional ping of her email. Laura had swung by earlier, feigning surprise at Charlie still working, offering a perfunctory "don't burn out" that rang hollow. It fueled Charlie's determination, a quiet fire against the jealousy-fueled sabotage. She powered through, organizing the chaos into coherent notes, but fatigue crept in, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped cold coffee. This wasn't just work. It was a test of endurance, one that highlighted the stark divide between her world and the polished ease of those above. By dawn, with the first light filtering through the blinds, she'd pieced it together, but at what cost? The thorn had drawn blood, deepening the strain, setting the stage for fractures yet to come. Charlie gathered her things, resolve hardened, unaware that this pressure cooker was just beginning to build. The conference room at Halden Corp felt heavier than usual that morning, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and lingering printer ink. The team had gathered for a progress update on the merger, papers scattered across the table like fallen leaves, charts projected on the wall glowing with financial projections. Daniel arrived first, as always, settling into his chair with a stack of revised contracts in hand. He'd grown accustomed to these sessions, the back and forth with Charlie sharpening his focus in unexpected ways. But as people filed in, his eyes caught on her. Slipping into her seat quietly, dark circles shadowing her eyes, her skin paler than he remembered, she moved with her usual precision,
flipping open her notebook. But there was a subtle drag in her steps, a weariness that tugged at something in him. He'd noticed it building over the past few days. Her arriving earlier, leaving later, the way her coffee cup seemed permanently attached to her hand. It nagged at him, this sign of strain in someone so unflinching. What was driving her so hard? The question simmered beneath his composed exterior, a faint echo of concern he wasn't used to feeling. Laura swept in next, her presence like a crisp wind, clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd been ramping up the pressure on Charlie, assigning endless tasks under the guise of mentorship, watching from afar as the intern buckled but didn't break. It satisfied a petty corner of her mind, restoring the order where she belonged, at the top of the pecking order. The meeting kicked off with routine updates, voices blending into a hum of corporate jargon, timelines, risks, synergies. Daniel steered the discussion, his voice steady, but his gaze kept drifting to Charlie. She contributed when called on, her insights as sharp as ever, dissecting a liability section with clear logic that cut through the noise. Yet her words came a beat slower, her posture a touch slumped, as if the weight of unseen burdens pressed down. Then came the pivot. Laura leaned forward during a lull, her tone casual but laced with barbs, targeting a minor delay in the compliance report Charlie had handled. "It's disappointing, really," she said, glancing around the table for allies. "We expect timeliness, especially on critical pieces. This kind of oversight could jeopardize the whole timeline." The criticism was baseless, inflated from a small hiccup caused by the overload Laura herself had imposed, but she delivered it with practiced finesse, implying carelessness where there was none. The room tensed. A few nods from junior staff who knew better than to contradict. Charlie felt the sting like a fresh bruise on top of her exhaustion. Nights blurred into days, juggling audits with hurried calls to the hospital, checking on her father's fluctuating vitals. She straightened, ready to defend herself calmly, but fatigue gulled her edge, making the words form slower in her mind. Before she could respond, Daniel's voice cut through, low and firm, like a line drawn in the sand. "That's enough," he interjected, his eyes locking on Laura with that piercing intensity that silenced rooms. He pointed out the report's thoroughness, how Charlie's work had uncovered issues no one else spotted, turning the delay into a necessary safeguard rather than a flaw. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a few measured sentences, but it shifted the air, redirecting the focus back to the merger's strengths. Laura blinked, her composure cracking for a split second, surprise flashing across her face, unused to being checked by the CEO over something so trivial. The table murmured in agreement, the moment passing like a brief storm, but it lingered in the undercurrents. Charlie sat there, a quiet shock rippling through her. Daniel defending her? It was unexpected, a small act that warmed the chill of her isolation, making her wonder if he'd seen more than she realized. Her heart steadied with a mix of gratitude and wariness. This wasn't pity, but something closer to respect, a crack in his armored world. As the meeting wrapped, Daniel lingered, watching Charlie gather her notes with renewed poise. Inside, a strange protectiveness stirred, unfamiliar and insistent, reminding him of vulnerabilities he'd long buried. Why did her fatigue bother him so much? It was just business, yet here he was, stepping in without thinking. Charlie headed out, the echo of his words bolstering her against the grind ahead. A doctor's update waiting, bills stacking up. Laura retreated to her office, irritation simmering. This intern was becoming more than a nuisance. The small defense hung in the air, a subtle sign of shifting tides, hinting at connections forming beneath the surface. The day rolled on, but that moment planted a seed, quiet and promising, in the midst of the corporate churn. The late hours at Halden Corp had become a relentless cycle for Charlie, the office transforming into a dimly lit labyrinth after everyone else clocked out. Night after night she hunkered down at her desk, surrounded by glowing screens and towering stacks of documents, piecing together audits and revisions that Laura kept dumping on her like an endless tide. The merger work with Daniel demanded precision during the day, but these extra assignments turned her evenings into marathons, cross-checking regulations until her vision blurred, typing reports with fingers that ached from the strain. Sleep came in snatches, maybe 3 or 4 hours if she was lucky, squeezed between rushed trips home to check on her father. His condition had taken a dip lately, the doctors murmuring about adjusting meds, and each hospital update hit her like a fresh wave of worry. The bills piled up in her mind, a constant hum beneath the exhaustion, pushing her to keep going, to prove she could handle it all without cracking. That particular Friday stretched longer than most. The team had wrapped a grueling session earlier, Daniel's unexpected defense still lingering in her thoughts like a small anchor in the storm. But as the building emptied, Laura's latest priority loomed, a full breakdown of international compliance risks, due by dawn for some fabricated deadline. Charlie settled in, coffee steaming beside her, the quiet hum of the air vents her only company. Hours ticked by. Midnight, then 2, her head throbbing as she sifted through dense paragraphs, highlighting inconsistencies that could sink the deal if ignored. Her body screamed for rest, eyes heavy, muscles tight from hunching over the keyboard, but she pushed on, thoughts drifting to her dad's frail smile during their last visit, how he'd squeezed her hand and said she was his fighter. Quitting wasn't an option. This job was their lifeline, even if it meant grinding herself down. By 4 a.m, the office felt like a ghost town, the city outside a dark void punctuated by distant lights. Charlie stood to stretch, grabbing the desk for balance as a wave of dizziness hit. She shook it off, blaming the stale air, and sat back down to finish the last section. But the room spun suddenly, her vision tunneling, heart racing in uneven beats. She reached for her water bottle, but her hand missed, knocking it over with a clatter. The world tilted and she slumped forward, forehead meeting the desk as darkness swallowed her up, exhaustion finally claiming its toll, her body giving out after weeks of relentless push. Daniel had stayed late too, up in his penthouse office, reviewing the day's notes with a restlessness he couldn't shake. Charlie's pallor during the meeting nagged at him, stirring memories he'd buried deep, flashes of his own past helplessness, watching his mother fade from illness when he was just a kid, powerless to stop it. He decided on a whim to check the lower floors, telling himself it was about security, but really, it was her. Descending in the elevator, the quiet amplified his unease. He wandered the legal wing, spotting the lone light from her cubicle. Approaching, he saw the spilled water, her slumped form, and panic hit like a gut punch, raw, unfamiliar, surging through his veins. He rushed over, gently lifting her head, his usual cool facade shattering as he called her name, voice tight with fear. Her pulse was steady but weak. He grabbed his phone for help, a protective urge roaring to life, fierce and undeniable. In that moment, holding her, the walls around his heart cracked wide, forging a bond he could no longer ignore. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, but for Daniel, the real emergency was the vulnerability she'd awakened in him. 2 weeks later. The grand ballroom of the downtown conference center buzzed with the weight of high-stakes decisions, chandeliers casting a golden glow over rows of shareholders in tailored suits and elegant dresses. It was the annual meeting, the pivotal one where the $3 billion merger would get its final stamp of approval, or unravel. Daniel stood at the podium, his presence as commanding as ever, outlining the revised terms with the confidence of a man who'd navigated rough waters. The past weeks had changed him subtly. Charlie's collapse had shaken something loose, forcing him to confront his own isolation. She'd recovered quickly, dehydration and exhaustion, the doctors said, but the image of her limp form haunted him, stirring a protectiveness that bled into his work. He'd insisted she take a few days off, overriding her protests, and in her absence, the office felt oddly empty. Now, with her back in the fold, seated quietly among the staff, he glanced her way, noting the faint shadows under her eyes, a reminder of her fragility amid the corporate grind. The agenda rolled on smoothly at first. Financial overviews, projections that painted a rosy future. Shareholders nodded along, murmurs of approval rippling through the crowd like a gentle wave. Laura waited in the wings, her moment scripted with precision. She'd spent nights crafting her plan, jealousy festering into something sharper after Daniel's public defense of Charlie. It wasn't just about reclaiming her spot. It was about eliminating the threat, restoring the hierarchy where upstarts like Charlie knew their place. As the floor opened for questions, Laura stepped forward, projector remote in hand, her smile polished and professional. She introduced a security update, her voice steady, framing it as a routine check that had uncovered something alarming. Slides flickered to life on the massive screen. Emails, timestamps, IP logs, all meticulously forged to look authentic. There was Charlie's name, linked to anonymous leaks of sensitive merger docs to a rival firm's server. Screenshots showed fragments of confidential clauses, watermarked with Halden's insignia, traced back to her workstation. Laura had hired a discreet tech expert, someone from the shadows of the industry, to weave the digital trail. Altered metadata, spoofed access points, even a planted USB drive in Charlie's desk drawer for good measure. It was airtight on the surface, timestamps aligning with her late-night sessions, email headers bouncing through proxies that pointed straight to her. This breach compromises everything, Laura explained calmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. Gasps echoed through the room as shareholders leaned forward, faces hardening with betrayal. Whispers grew. How could an intern access such files? Was it sabotage? Charlie sat frozen, the blood draining from her face as the slides built their case. Her mind raced, piecing together the impossibility. She'd never touched those documents outside protocol, certainly never leaked them. But the proof stared back, convincing even to her trained eye. Forged so cleverly it mimicked her patterns, down to the way she annotated notes. Panic clawed at her chest, mingling with the exhaustion that still lingered from her faint. Thoughts of her father flashed, his hospital room, the fragile stability this job provided, now teetering on the edge. She scanned the room, seeing doubt etch into colleagues' expressions, the weight of accusations settling like a fog. Daniel's jaw tightened from the podium, his eyes flicking between the screen and Charlie, a storm brewing inside. The evidence was damning, stirring old scars of betrayal from his past, a business partner who'd sold him out years ago, leaving him wary of trust. Logic screamed caution, but that new protectiveness tugged, questioning the perfection of it all. Laura wrapped up with a somber tone, suggesting immediate action to safeguard the merger. Investigation, suspension. The room erupted in low chatter, shareholders demanding answers, the air thick with suspicion. Charlie felt isolated in the crowd. Her integrity, the one thing she'd clung to through poverty and hardship, now shredded publicly. It was a flawless performance, Laura's trap snapping shut, redirecting every eye toward the young intern as the villain. In that charged moment, alliances fractured, setting the stage for fallout that would test them all. The merger hung by a thread, but deeper still, bonds forged in quiet debates now faced their harshest trial. The chaos in the ballroom thickened like smoke after Laura's presentation. Projectors hummed faintly, still displaying those damning slides, forged emails and logs that painted Charlie as the saboteur, her name glowing like an accusation under the bright lights. Shareholders leaned into clusters, faces etched with outrage, demanding accountability as the merger's future teetered. Daniel remained at the podium, his grip on the edges tightening until his knuckles whitened, the room's energy pressing against him like a rising tide. He'd built Halden on unyielding control, but this betrayal unearthed ghosts from his past. A former mentor who'd leaked secrets and shattered his early ventures, leaving him to rebuild alone in the ruins. Trust, once broken, became a luxury he couldn't afford. It clouded judgment, invited ruin. And now, staring at the evidence, that old wound split open, raw and insistent, drowning out the quiet voice that had grown fond of Charlie's integrity. Charlie sat amid the storm, her world narrowing to the pounding in her ears, the weight of every eye pinning her in place. The slides blurred through unshed tears of shock. How could this happen? She'd poured everything into this job, late nights blurring into dawns, all to keep her father's care afloat, to carve a path from the shadows of poverty. The accusations didn't just sting, they gutted her, stripping away the dignity she'd fought so hard to maintain. She glanced at Daniel, searching for a flicker of doubt, a hint of the man who'd defended her days ago, who'd hovered by her side after her collapse like he cared. But his expression was stone, eyes distant, as if she'd already become a stranger. Inside, panic swirled with despair. Losing this meant more than a paycheck. It meant watching her dad's health slip further, the hospital calls turning desperate, her dreams crumbling back into the cramped apartment where hope felt like a luxury. Daniel raised a hand for silence, his voice slicing through the din, steady but laced with ice. The room hushed, hanging on his words, the air electric with anticipation. He addressed the crowd first, acknowledging the breach's severity, promising a full internal probe to safeguard their investments. But beneath the corporate poise, fury boiled, betrayed again by someone he'd let close, whose sharp mind had chipped at his walls, making him vulnerable. Pride surged, overriding reason. He couldn't appear weak, couldn't let emotion sway him in front of these power players. Without pausing for her side, without a private word, he turned his gaze to Charlie, cold and final. "Effective immediately, your internship is terminated," he declared, the words dropping like a gavel, echoing off the walls. Gasps rippled anew, shareholders nodding in grim satisfaction, the decision restoring a semblance of order. Charlie's breath caught, the floor seeming to drop away as reality crashed in. Fired, publicly humiliated, her reputation in tatters. She stood slowly, legs unsteady, gathering her things with numb hands, the room's stairs burning like spotlights. Thoughts raced to practicalities, job hunts starting over, bills mounting, her father's voice on the phone asking if she was okay. But deeper, a profound hurt bloomed. Daniel's dismissal without a chance to defend herself felt like the ultimate rejection, erasing the budding respect she'd sensed between them. She walked out, head high despite the tremor in her steps, the doors swinging shut behind her like a chapter slamming closed. Daniel watched her go, a pang twisting in his chest, but he shoved it down, convincing himself it was necessary, better to cut losses, protect the empire. Yet as the meeting resumed, the victory tasted bitter, his world feeling a shade emptier. Laura hid a satisfied smile in the back, her scheme unfolding perfectly. But the real unraveling had just begun, threads of trust fraying in ways no one could foresee. The merger pressed on, but for Charlie, stepping into the harsh daylight outside, everything had shattered, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. He chose to believe the lie, and she paid the price. But we all know the truth is still out there, waiting. If you want the truth to prevail, leave the word truth below. The days following the shareholder meeting blurred into a monotonous grind for Daniel. The penthouse office that once felt like a throne room, now echoing with a hollow silence. Charlie had vanished like a shadow at dawn. Just an empty desk cleared out by security under his orders. The merger pushed forward, salvaged by swift damage control. New firewalls, reassigned tasks, assurances to investors that the breach was contained. Board members patted him on the back during calls, praising his decisive action, the way he'd protected the empire without hesitation. On paper, it was a win. Stocks stabilized, the deal inching toward closure. But as Daniel stared out at the city skyline, coffee growing cold in his hand, a profound emptiness settled in, like the vast view outside mirrored the void inside. Work, his reliable anchor, felt mechanical now. Reports scrolling across his screen without sparking the usual fire. He powered through meetings, his voice commanding as ever, but his mind wandered to her. The quiet intern who'd challenged him, made him question, and now left a gap he couldn't fill. Nights were worse, sleep elusive in his sleek apartment high above the streets, where the hum of traffic below couldn't drown out the unrest. Dreams crept in uninvited, vivid and punishing, revisiting that stormy night from his past, the one he'd buried deep. Rain pounded the windows like accusations, the memory of his mother's final days replaying. Her weakened form in the hospital bed, the helplessness as doctors shook their heads, bills stacking up while he, a teenager, promised to fix it all someday. He'd built Halden from that pain, vowing never to be vulnerable again. But behind that cold exterior is still a lonely heart, longing for love and warmth. Now, the nightmares twisted, blending old grief with new. Charlie's face appearing in the downpour, her eyes wide with the despair he'd seen in that ballroom, pleading silently as she faded into the storm. He'd wake in a sweat, heart racing, the sheets tangled like his thoughts. Was it guilt? Or something deeper? A realization that firing her had echoed his own abandonment, cutting off the one person who'd seen through his armor without judgment. The dreams punished him, night after night, forcing him to relive the moment he'd declared her gone, her stricken expression haunting him like a ghost. Even routine tasks amplified the hollowness. During a solo lunch in his office, usually a quick sandwich while scanning emails, he found himself pausing, half expecting her to walk in with a fresh insight, their debates sparking like intellectual fireworks. The conference room, once alive with their back and forth, now felt sterile, team members tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. Laura had stepped up seamlessly, her reports crisp and on time, but they lacked the depth Charlie brought, the ethical nudge that had subtly reshaped his approach. He caught himself second-guessing decisions, wondering what she'd say about a clause or a risk, the absence gnawing at his confidence. Friends, the few he had in his guarded world, noticed the change during rare dinners, commenting on his distraction, but he brushed it off with a forced laugh, steering talk back to business. Inside, the victory tasted like ash. He'd won the battle for control, but lost the spark that made the fight worthwhile. Thoughts of her hardship flickered unbidden, the exhaustion that led to her collapse, the quiet strength that hid who knows what burdens. Had he been too quick, too proud to listen? One evening, scrolling through old merger drafts on his laptop, he stumbled on her annotations, neat, incisive notes in the margins that challenged and improved his work. A pang hit hard, mixing nostalgia with shame. The rain started outside, pattering against the glass, pulling him back to those nightmares where her desperate gaze merged with his mother's fading one. This was his punishment, he realized, not from others, but from within.
The emptiness of a winner who'd sacrificed the wrong piece. The empire stood firm, but Daniel felt adrift, questioning if control was worth the cost.
Little did he know, this void was the first crack in his facade, setting the stage for a reckoning that could rebuild him. The emptiness that had settled over Daniel began to shift into something sharper, a nagging doubt that whispered through his days like an unwelcome draft. The merger inched forward, paperwork piling up on his desk, but the flawless presentation of those leaked documents haunted him more than the nightmares. It was too perfect. The timestamps aligning just so, the trails leading straight to Charlie without a single loose end. In his experience, real betrayals were messy, full of human error, not this polished precision that screamed setup. He'd dismissed her in the heat of the moment, pride and past scars blinding him, but now, alone in his office with the city humming below, questions crept in. What if he'd been played? What if her quiet integrity, the one thing that had drawn him in, was real after all? He started small, late one evening when the building was quiet, pulling up the digital forensics report Laura had provided. Fingers flying across the keyboard, he cross-checked the metadata himself, something he'd delegated before but now felt compelled to verify. The files showed access from Charlie's IP, but as he dug deeper, tracing server logs, examining encryption keys, a subtle anomaly caught his eye. The timestamps overlapped with times he knew she'd been in meetings with him, her laptop idle on the conference table. It didn't add up. Doubt bloomed into suspicion, stirring that protective instinct he'd felt when she collapsed. He couldn't shake the image of her pale face in the ballroom, the shock in her eyes. Not guilt, but genuine hurt. Had he destroyed an innocent person to protect his ego? Daniel kept it secret, working after hours in a private server he accessed from home away from prying eyes. He hired a discreet cybersecurity expert, an old contact from his early days, swearing him to silence. Together they peeled back layers, analyzing the email headers, running reverse traces on the proxies. One night, as rain streaked the windows again, mirroring his turbulent thoughts, a breakthrough emerged. The leaked documents had traces of editing software not standard at Halden. Subtle watermarks altered in ways that pointed to internal tampering. His heart quickened. This wasn't outsider sabotage, but an inside job, crafted with company resources. Memories flooded back. Laura's eager presentation, her quick rise after the fallout, the way she'd always eyed Charlie with thinly veiled disdain. Jealousy? Ambition? The pieces fit too neatly to ignore. As the investigation deepened, guilt twisted in his gut, blending with the hollow ache of her absence. He'd replay their debates in his mind, her calm logic challenging him to be better, and now he'd repaid it with blind condemnation. The nightmares evolved, no longer just loss, but accusation. Her voice echoing in the storm, asking why he hadn't trusted her. By week's end, with preliminary evidence stacking up, Daniel sat in the dim light of his study, files spread before him like a map of his mistakes. The crack in the lie had widened, forcing him to confront not just the deception, but his own role in it. What would he do with the truth? The question hung heavy, pulling him toward redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. The cracks in the facade widened into a chasm that night, as Daniel sat hunched over his desk in the dim glow of his home office, the city lights outside a blurred backdrop to his unraveling world. The cybersecurity expert's final report had arrived via encrypted email, a digital bombshell he opened with trembling hands. Line by line it laid bare the truth. Altered server logs traced back to Laura's personal device. Hidden payments to a freelance hacker buried in expense reports she'd approved herself. The forged emails? Crafted on her laptop during off hours. Metadata scrubbed, but not quite clean enough. It was all there, irrefutable. A web of deceit spun from jealousy and ambition, aimed squarely at Charlie to clear her own path upward. Daniel leaned back, the chair creaking under him like a sigh, as the weight of it crashed down. He'd been so sure, so quick to judge, letting old betrayals cloud his vision. But now, staring at the screen, he saw himself not as the wounded leader, but the fool who'd wielded the axe. Charlie, innocent, driven by that quiet fire he'd come to admire, had been sacrificed on the altar of his pride. Memories flooded in. Her collapse in the office, the way she'd fought through exhaustion without complaint, her insights that had saved the merger time and again. He'd repaid her with public humiliation, stripping away her livelihood, her dignity, all because he couldn't bear the risk of being wrong. The empire he'd built, once a shield against vulnerability, now felt like a cage of his own making. A wave of nausea hit, twisting his gut as guilt sharpened into self-loathing. He paced the room, shadows stretching long across the floor, replaying the shareholder meeting in his mind. The cold finality of his words, her stricken face as she walked out. He wasn't the victim here. He was the villain, blinded by arrogance, destroying someone who embodied the integrity he'd lost along the way. Thoughts of his mother's illness resurfaced, raw and accusing. How he'd vowed to protect the vulnerable, yet here he was, crushing one underfoot. His ego, that unyielding fortress, crumbled in the silence, leaving him exposed, hollowed out. What had he done? The truth wasn't just about Laura's scheme. It was a mirror to his flaws, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Only a burning resolve to make it right, no matter the cost. The rain started again outside, tapping insistently, as if urging him toward the hard path ahead. The daily coffee. Steaming espresso machines hissing, customers chatting over laptops, the scent of fresh pastries mingling with ground beans. Charlie moved behind the counter with mechanical efficiency, her apron smudged from hours of wiping spills, hair tied back in a hasty ponytail that did little to hide the fatigue etched into her features. Weeks had passed since that devastating meeting, and she'd landed here out of sheer necessity, pouring lattes and ringing up orders to scrape together enough for her father's meds, the hospital visits that now consumed her evenings. The job was a far cry from the corporate world, but it kept the lights on in their tiny apartment, where worry hung heavy like the damp air after a storm. She looked thinner, shadows under her eyes speaking of restless nights, replaying the humiliation, the cold dismissal that had shattered her trust in fairness. Yet she held her head up, serving with quiet politeness, her inner resolve a shield against the pitying glances from regulars who sensed her story without knowing it. Daniel had tracked her down through discreet inquiries, old HR files, a tip from a mutual contact, driven by the guilt that now shadowed his every step. He stepped inside, the bell jingling like an unwelcome announcement, his tailored coat out of place amid the casual crowd. Spotting her, his chest tightened. She looked worn, a ghost of the vibrant intellect he'd come to rely on, and it hit him like a fresh wound. He approached the counter during a lull, heart pounding beneath his composed exterior, the weight of his mistakes pressing down. The truth about Laura's scheme burned in his pocket, printouts of evidence, ready to show. But words faltered as he met her gaze. Her eyes, once warm with determination, now held a distant chill, like a door slammed shut against an intruder. He started softly, voice low amid the cafe noise, apologizing for the rush to judgment, the public firing that had upended her life. He mentioned the investigation, how he'd uncovered the forgeries, but the sentences felt hollow even as they left his lips. Empty promises from a man who'd wielded power without care.
Charlie listened without a word, wiping the counter in slow circles, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. No anger flared, no tears, just that quiet detachment, as if he'd become irrelevant, a chapter she'd closed to survive. Inside, her heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but the reminder of her vulnerability, the way she'd dared to hope in his world, only to be cast out. Daniel pressed on, offering reinstatement, compensation, but her lack of response cut deeper than any rebuke. He realized then, standing there amid the clatter of cups, that apologies were meaningless without action. He'd have to prove his change, not just speak it. He left quietly, the bell marking his exit, the encounter leaving him more broken, her resolve hardened in the quiet aftermath. The cafe carried on, but for you, will the path of reconciliation easy? The weight of that cafe encounter clung to Daniel like a shadow as he drove back to Halden Corp. Her silence had been louder than any shout, a mirror reflecting back his inadequacy, words tumbling out uselessly, failing to bridge the chasm he'd created. Back in his penthouse office, the space felt colder, the panoramic view a mocking reminder of his isolated heights. He sank into his chair, the evidence against Laura spread across his desk like scattered puzzle pieces. Digital trails, falsified logs, all pointing to her calculated betrayal. Firing her would be easy, a quiet internal fix. But as he stared at the merger documents, the $4 billion beast he'd chased relentlessly, a deeper realization settled in. Apologies weren't enough. Trust, once shattered, demanded proof. A sacrifice that cost him something real, something visible not just to Charlie but to everyone he'd let down. He paced the room, the carpet muffling his steps, mind racing through the implications. The merger wasn't flawless. Charlie's early insights had revealed ethical shortcuts, clauses that favored profits over people, risks buried in fine print that could harm employees and communities down the line. He'd pushed them aside before, blinded by ambition, but now they glared back, echoes of his own flaws. Canceling the deal outright? It would tank stock prices, invite lawsuits from partners, erode the board's faith in him. His empire, built brick by brick from nothing, could crumble. Years of control slipping away. Yet, as rain began to patter against the windows again, stirring those haunting nightmares, he saw it clearly. This was the price of redemption. Not a private gesture, but a public one, laying bare his mistakes to reclaim integrity. It wasn't just for her, it was for the man he wanted to become, shedding the armor that had isolated him for so long. Memories surfaced unbidden. His mother's final days, how corporate greed had denied her affordable care, fueling his drive to succeed but twisting him into someone who mirrored that very system. Charlie had challenged that, her quiet principles a beacon he'd extinguished too soon. Now thoughts of her tattered resolve in that cafe fueled his decision. She deserved more than words. She deserved to see him choose right over easy. He sat down, pulling up emails to the board and PR team, outlining the press conference. No more hiding behind facades. He'd admit the setup, expose Laura's scheme, and pull the plug on the merger, citing the unearthed flaws as untenable. The fallout would be brutal. Financial hits, reputational blows, but it felt like liberation. A step toward earning back what mattered. His hand steadied on the keyboard, a quiet determination replacing the guilt. Knowing this act of sacrifice could rebuild bridges, not just with her, but with himself. A click was placed down, strong and decisive as the man himself. The office began to buzz. A shift occurred. Arrogance giving way to humility, control to courage. It was risky, potentially ruinous, but real change always was. Little did he know this pivotal choice would ripple outward, proving his growth in ways words never could, setting the stage for justice to unfold. The rain intensified, washing the windows clean, mirroring the cleansing storm brewing in his soul. The press conference room at Halden Corp's headquarters buzzed with anticipation, cameras flashing like distant lightning, reporters murmuring over notepads as microphones crowded the podium. Daniel stood there under the harsh lights, his usual commanding presence tempered by a quiet resolve, the weight of his decision etched in the lines around his eyes. He'd called this gathering swiftly, no leaks, just a terse announcement that promised major news on the merger. Shareholders tuned in remotely, the board fidgeting in the front row, unaware of the bomb he was about to drop. This wasn't damage control, it was demolition. A deliberate unraveling of the facade he'd upheld for years. The merger, that glittering prize, now felt tainted, built on shortcuts and lies that echoed his own blindness. He began steadily, voice carrying through the speakers, admitting the breach allegations had been a setup, orchestrated from within. Flanked by screens displaying the evidence, screenshots of forged logs, transaction records linking Laura to the hacker, he laid it out plainly, no spin. Laura's scheme unfolded before them. Jealousy-fueled forgeries aimed at an innocent intern, all to climb the ladder. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he named her, security footage playing silently, showing her accessing restricted servers after hours.
It was thorough, damning, her ambition exposed like a raw nerve. But Daniel didn't stop there. He turned the spotlight inward, confessing his rush to judgment, how pride had blinded him to the truth, costing someone their livelihood and shaking the company's core. Then came the hammer. The merger was off. The room erupted in murmurs, flashes intensifying as he explained. The deal's foundations were rotten, riddled with ethical flaws he'd ignored in the chase for billions. It wasn't just about the setup. It was about integrity over profit. Choosing right, even if it meant financial hits, stock dips, potential backlash. Reporters fired questions, but he held firm, the sacrifice hanging in the air like a cleansing breath. This public reckoning wasn't for show. It was his atonement, visible and raw, proving change through action. Charlie, watching from her apartment on a grainy live stream, drawn by a tip from an old colleague, felt a stir deep inside, the walls around her heart cracking just a fraction. Her father's hand squeezed hers nearby, the hospital bills still stacking, but this moment sparked a quiet hope. The conference wrapped amid chaos, Daniel stepping away with a lighter step, the empire bruised, but his soul mending. Justice had spoken publicly, setting ripples that promised healing ahead. The fallout from the press conference hit like a tidal wave, the news cycle churning with headlines about Halden's implosion, stocks dipping sharply, analysts buzzing over Daniel's bold move. But amid the chaos, justice zeroed in on Laura, her carefully built world crumbling faster than she could grasp. Security escorted her from her office that very afternoon, her face pale as she clutched a box of personal items, colleagues averting their eyes in the hallways she'd once dominated. The evidence Daniel presented was ironclad, digital footprints leading straight to her, bank transfers to shady tech contacts, all laid bare for the authorities. By evening, the police were involved, charges of corporate espionage, fraud, forgery, piling up like overdue bills. Laura's arrest made the evening news, her polished image shattered in handcuffs, a public spectacle that satisfied that deep craving for accountability. No more climbing on others' backs. She'd face court dates, potential prison time, her career in ruins. A fitting end for the schemer who'd nearly destroyed an innocent life out of petty envy. Charlie watched it unfold from her apartment, the TV flickering in the dim light as her father dozed nearby, his breathing steadier after a good day at the clinic. The sight of Laura's downfall stirred a quiet vindication in her,
Not glee, but a release, like exhaling after holding her breath too long. The betrayal had cut deep, shaking her faith in fairness, but seeing consequences stick felt like the world righting itself, a balm on wounds that still ached. She hadn't sought revenge. Survival had been her focus, scraping by at the cafe, dodging questions from friends about her sudden fall. But this? It whispered that integrity mattered, that the underdog could win without turning bitter. Daniel, meanwhile, navigated the storm from the eye, fielding calls, drafting statements, his office a war room of ringing phones and scribbled notes. The merger's cancellation had sparked a media frenzy, questions flying about Halden's future, his leadership. He could have handled it alone, as always, but something pulled him to reach out. A quiet call to Charlie, not begging forgiveness, but offering partnership. "We built this deal together. Help me steer through the mess." She hesitated, the hurt still fresh, but curiosity and a spark of that old fire drew her in. The next day, she stepped back into the building, not as an intern, but an equal, sitting across from him in the conference room as they mapped out responses. For the first time, they worked as a true team. No power plays, just shared purpose. Daniel deferred to her insights on ethical framing, her calm logic cutting through the panic, while he handled the financial spin. Laughter even slipped in during a late-night session, over cold pizza and strategy boards, a tentative bridge forming amid the crisis. Charlie felt empowered, her voice valued without strings, a far cry from the shadows she'd endured. Daniel, watching her sketch out a press release, felt the void fill. A partnership born from ashes, proving his change was real. The media tide turned slowly, praise trickling in for transparency, but for them, the real victory was this unity. Justice not just served, but shared. The storm raged on, but together they stood firm, hints of deeper connection blooming in the quiet moments. The storm around Halden Corp had settled into a tentative calm, the media frenzy quieting as the company regained footing after Laura's exposure and the merger's collapse. In the late afternoon light, Daniel and Charlie stood on the rooftop terrace of the headquarters, a rare break from the whirlwind of crisis management. The city sprawled below, a tapestry of lights flickering to life, the air cool with the promise of fall. They'd spent days working side by side, rebuilding trust through shared strategy, their partnership blossoming into something unspoken yet undeniable. Daniel leaned against the railing, his usual polished exterior softened. No tie, sleeves rolled up, a man who'd shed layers of armor. Charlie stood nearby, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, her face less guarded than it had been in that coffee shop, though the weight of past hurts lingered in her cautious stance. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head, late at night when guilt and hope wrestled for control. The man who once commanded boardrooms with unyielding certainty now felt raw, vulnerable. His heart laid bare by her resilience, her integrity that never wavered despite the odds. As the sun dipped low, casting golden hues across the skyline, he turned to her, the words coming not as a grand speech, but a quiet confession, raw and unpolished. He spoke of his regrets, not just the firing, but the walls he'd built, the arrogance that blinded him to her truth. His voice carried the weight of lessons learned, admitting he'd fallen for her. Not for her brilliance alone, but for the way she made him want to be better, to trade control for connection. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only the chance to prove himself, to stand beside her as an equal. Charlie listened, her hands tucked into her pockets, the city's hum a soft backdrop to his words. The betrayal had scarred her, but his actions, exposing Laura, scrapping the tainted deal, had chipped away at her defenses. She saw a different man now, humbled, his eyes holding not just apology, but promise. Memories of her father's encouragement to hold fast to hope stirred within her. Mingling with the warmth of their newfound teamwork, she felt the pull of something deeper, a partnership rooted in mutual respect, not power. As he finished, silence hung between them, heavy with possibility. She nodded, a small gesture but enough. A quiet acceptance of his heart, a step toward healing. He gently placed a kiss on her lips. She felt a slight tremble in that moment. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Under the sunset light, it depicted a couple with eternal love. This was their triumph, not just love, but a life rooted in trust, built to last. Daniel and Charlie's journey has come to a close, proving that integrity is sometimes the most valuable asset. In your opinion, in real life, what is more important for true happiness? Success or dignity? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for listening.